Yo, what's up, everyone? It's your boy Disaster. Welcome to a place where there's no turning back. This is a marathon designed to put you under. Whether it's scorching summer or a rainy spring outside, forget about it. In here, the rain never stops, and the year is nothing but a bone-chilling, frozen winter. The sky out there? It's never gonna clear up. Here's the deal, and I need you to follow my lead. Get to your room, kill the lights, and throw on your headphones. Lay back, get comfortable, and hit that auto replay setting. Close both eyes, and listen till the very end. I'm telling you, the dread levels are gonna spike with every passing minute. And look, before we dive into the abyss, if you feel like this hour of horror is worth it, smash that like button. It doesn't cost you a dime, but it means the world to me. I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into crafting this hour-long nightmare just for you. Brace yourself, boss, it's time for some ice-cold horror. Enjoy the ride. November 1998, the dark, forbidding, and deeply isolated outskirts of the Black Forest in Germany. A brutal, howling blizzard combined with unrelenting sheets of freezing, jagged ice rain battered the snow-choked wooden cabins tucked deep within the frozen wilderness, completely cutting them off from any form of civilization, emergency services, or passing traffic. Inside a heavily reinforced, multi-story timber chalet, retired international arms dealer Ulrich Fischer sat in a leather armchair drinking expensive, aged whiskey with three of his closest former business associates. They were deep into a lavish, celebratory evening, gloating over the final signatures of a lucrative, multi-million-dollar munitions contract that had systematically destroyed the lives of countless families and razed entire villages across the Middle East. The roaring stone fireplace cast long, flickering shadows across the wood-paneled walls, drowning out the violent howling of the wind outside. But at precisely 2:15 a.m., the main electrical power lines and the underground telephone cables snapped simultaneously under the massive, accumulating weight of the ice storm, plunging the entire property into total, pitch-black obscurity. The warm, humming lamps died instantly, leaving only the dying embers of the fireplace to illuminate the room in a sickly, pulsating red glow. Without a single moment of warning, the heavy, iron-reinforced oak front door of the chalet was violently blasted inward off its hinges by a single, colossal, bone-shattering blow from a massive woodsman's felling axe that instantly pulverized the deadlocks and sent jagged splinters flying across the floorboards. A tall, towering figure clad head to toe in a heavy, glistening rubberized canvas waterproof coat and a rigid, expressionless leather mask stepped across the broken threshold without uttering a single word. The air in the room instantly dropped 20 degrees, carrying the heavy, suffocating scent of wet pine, ozone, and copper. Before Ulrich Fischer or any of his armed associates could comprehend what was happening, the intruder moved with a terrifying, calculated speed that defied human limits. Within 90 breathless seconds, the warmly lit living room was transformed into a freezing, blood-soaked slaughterhouse. The three business associates were systematically executed one by one with precise, sweeping hatchet strikes delivered directly to the neck and upper chest, moving with such brutal mechanical efficiency that none of them even managed to unholster the concealed handguns resting inside their shoulder holsters. As the last of the three men collapsed heavily onto the rug with a wet, gurgling gasp, the tall figure stepped over the pooling blood, the heavy rubber boots making a soft, sickening squelch against the wood. Ulrich Fischer remained frozen in his chair, paralyzed by a mixture of shock and primal terror, watching as the masked executioner slowly turned its head toward him, raising the heavy, dark steel blade of the felling axe as the storm raged louder outside the shattered doorway. Ulrich tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed instantly by an oppressive, suffocating pressure that seemed to vacuum all the oxygen out of the room. The executioner didn't strike immediately, instead stepping closer until the freezing stench of ancient river mud and rain-drenched rubber choked Fisher's lungs. With agonizing slowness, a gloved hand reached out, grabbed Fisher by the collar of his expensive silk shirt, and hoisted him out of the leather armchair as if he weighed nothing at all. 3 slow, rhythmic raps echoed from the dark timber beams overhead, perfectly mirrored by the heavy strikes of falling ice against the cabin glass. As Fisher's vision began to blur from the tight grip around his throat, he caught a horrifying glimpse of his own face reflected in the polished steel blade of the axe, not as an aging arms dealer, but as an empty, staring husk carved into a permanent ledger of blood. Ulrich Fischer did not die on the blood-soaked rug of the living room floor. Instead, he was violently seized by the collar, hauled up by his feet, and dragged mercilessly across the splintered floorboards down the dark, echoing hallway toward the timber workshop at the rear of the cabin. His desperate fingernails scraped futilely against the wood, leaving faint streaks of dust as he whimpered in absolute terror, entirely paralyzed by the sheer physical dominance of his assailant. The workshop was freezing, lit only by the pale, ghostly moonlight filtering through the high, frosted windows against which the relentless blizzard continued to hurl sheets of wet snow and sleet. When local police patrol units finally arrived hours later following a frantic midnight call from a terrified neighbor who reported total darkness and an eerie silence at the Fisher estate, they stepped into a scene of unspeakable, calculated horror. The heavy front door was hanging limply by a single twisted hinge, and inside the main living room, the 3 former business associates were sprawled lifeless across the floor, their bodies systematically arranged in a rigid, terrifying line. Moving cautiously with their flashlights drawn and service weapons raised, the lead detectives pushed open the door to the rear timber workshop, their breath pluming white in the freezing air. There, Fisher was found strapped securely and brutally to a massive oak carpentry workbench using heavy industrial-grade nylon cargo straps pulled tight across his chest and arms. Right beside his left ear, driven deep into the solid wood with such immense force that the handle was still vibrating, sat the massive, dark steel felling axe used in the executions, its blade dripping with dark residue. Remarkably, the killer had not touched a single euro of the loose cash, expensive watches, or high-end handguns sitting carelessly inside the open wall safe across the room. The wealth had been entirely ignored, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was never a robbery or a crime of opportunity. Instead, the intruder had systematically ripped open every filing cabinet, desk drawer, and storage box, gathering all personal identification dossiers, military contracts, and photographic archives belonging to Fisher and his associates. These documents had been carried over to the heavy stone hearth in the corner and burned down to fine, gray ash, leaving behind zero trace of the victims' professional lives or their illicit global operations. Scratched crudely and deeply into the charred pine wall directly above the workbench, carved with an old, angular Germanic rune using the tip of a hunting knife, was a single chilling message that made the seasoned detective's blood run cold: justice has arrived. Federal investigators and forensic teams scoured the surrounding black forest for days, braving the treacherous snowbanks and freezing winds, but the relentless downpour and drifting powder had completely erased every single trace of footprints, tire tracks, or biological evidence. The perpetrator had slipped back into the dense, swaying canopy of the frozen forest as if the very earth had opened up, swallowed them whole, and sealed the snow back over their vanishing path, leaving the local authorities with nothing more than an open file and a lingering ghost in the woods. Though Fisher survived his physical ordeal, spending months under heavy police protection inside a secure psychiatric ward in Munich, he never spoke another coherent word. Whenever doctors attempted to question him about the masked assailant, he would only stare blankly at the sterile white walls, frantically scratching his own wrists with his fingernails until they bled. In his hospital room, no matter how many times the nursing staff locked the heavy double-paned windows against the freezing alpine wind, a thin layer of dark, damp forest mud would invariably materialize across the linoleum floor every night at precisely 2:15 a.m. A single, heavy drop of water would fall from the ceiling vent, striking the center of his bedside table, carrying the distinct, suffocating scent of wet pine and copper. Nurses reported hearing faint, measured footsteps pacing back and forth on the empty balcony outside his locked ward, accompanied by the chilling, rhythmic cadence of 3 slow raps echoing against the glass, reminding everyone within those sterile corridors that the ledger had not yet been fully closed, and the executioner always returned to collect what was owed when the snow began to fall. October 2005, the sprawling, heavily industrialized commercial shipping port of Yokohama, Japan, was locked in the relentless grip of a ferocious, typhoon-driven downpour that hammered the concrete piers and rusted drydocks with punishing fury. The torrential sheets of rain and 50-knot wind gusts brought all maritime container traffic and dockside operations to a complete, dead standstill, turning the massive shipping yards into a labyrinth of slick, reflecting surfaces and deep, swirling puddles. Deep inside cargo warehouse number 12, a cavernous, windowless monolith of corrugated steel and reinforced concrete tucked far away from the main security gates, a high-ranking Yakuza syndicate boss named Kenji Sato was holding a clandestine, closed-door midnight summit with 4 of his most trusted, heavily armed enforcers. The interior of the warehouse smelled heavily of sea salt, diesel fuel, and damp cardboard. Resting on a scarred wooden crate in the center of the corrugated steel enclosure was a heavy velvet-lined steel case containing a multi-million-dollar consignment of smuggled raw diamonds, alongside a thick stack of highly sensitive physical extortion ledgers, blackmail photographs, and encrypted microcassettes targeting corrupt high-ranking government officials, corporate executives, and banking regulators across the Tokyo prefecture. Sato had spent the last 2 hours barking orders, finalizing distribution routes, and demanding absolute silence and loyalty from his men, entirely unaware that their movements were being meticulously monitored from the darkened catwalks high above. At precisely 3 a.m., the warehouse's primary industrial diesel generator, housed in a secure exterior concrete annex, suffered a sudden, catastrophic mechanical failure as a heavy surge of water flooded its intake valves, instantly cutting off all interior illumination and plunging the endless concrete aisles into absolute, pitch-black obscurity. The humming security monitors blinked out, the overhead sodium vapor lamps died with a sharp electric pop, and the vast interior was reduced to a suffocating vault of shadow and sound. Before any of the Yakuza enforcers could reach for the emergency flashlights mounted on the walls, a series of lightning-fast, highly disciplined sounds echoed through the damp, echoing air above the drumbeat of the rain, the faint, metallic screech of structural steel shifting under a sudden weight, the sharp, whisper-quiet snap of suppressed micro-caliber rounds, and the heavy, deadened thud of human bodies colliding with the concrete floor. The entire tactical assault was executed with terrifying precision and total economy of movement. Within the span of 2 breathless minutes, all 4 armed bodyguards were systematically neutralized with professional, contact-range bullets driven straight into the brainstem, delivered with such absolute ballistic accuracy that not a single man managed to squeeze off a return round, yell a warning, or sound the perimeter alarm. Kenji Sato, suddenly left entirely alone in the suffocating dark, stumbled backward over a crate, his breath catching in his throat as the unmistakable sound of heavy combat boots approached him across the wet concrete floor, coming closer with every measured, unhurried step. Trembling violently, Sato groped frantically across the scarred timber box until his fingers brushed against the cold steel grip of his custom-engraved 9mm pistol. He yanked the weapon free, thumbed off the safety, and unleashed a panicked flurry of blind gunfire into the empty shadows, the muzzle flashes casting frantic, strobing bursts of light against the corrugated iron walls. The bullets ricocheted wildly off the concrete floor with piercing metallic screeches, but the relentless approach never faltered or slowed by a single fraction of a second. Out of the pitch-black void, a towering, rubber-clad hand emerged with terrifying speed, wrapping an iron grip around Sato's wrist and crushing the bones until his fingers went completely numb, forcing the pistol to clatter uselessly onto the ground. As Sato was hoisted effortlessly into the air by his throat, his boots kicking wildly against the damp concrete, a cold, heavy blade pressed firmly against his skin while three slow, rhythmic raps echoed through the cavernous rafters above, marking the final entry in a blood-soaked ledger that had already claimed everyone who dared cross its path. Kenji Sato panicked, scrambling blindly across the wet concrete floor in the absolute pitch blackness, his hands slipping wildly against slick metal shipping crates and discarded packing materials as the heavy, deliberate footsteps closed in behind him. Driven by pure, blind survival instinct, he bolted toward the heavy steel loading bay doors at the rear of the warehouse, throwing his entire weight against the emergency release bar. The heavy door groaned on its rusted tracks, sliding open just enough to reveal the blinding sheets of rain lashing against the open concrete dock outside. Sato threw himself through the narrow gap into the stormy night air, intending to run toward the administrative blocks, but he froze dead in his tracks. Standing directly in the center of the loading ramp, completely unbothered by the torrential downpour, was a tall, imposing figure clad in a dark tactical wetsuit and a heavy waterproof canvas coat that whipped violently in the gale-force winds. Before Sato could turn back or scream, a gloved hand shot forward with terrifying speed, clamping around his throat like an industrial vice and lifting him completely off his feet with effortless physical dominance. When the Yokohama Harbor Patrol Tactical Unit finally breached cargo warehouse number 12 minutes later, drawn by a silent automated perimeter sensor trip rather than gunfire, they stepped into a meticulously curated scene of cold efficiency. Inside the glass-walled executive office, the four Yakuza enforcers were found dead in their chairs and across the floor, killed by single, flawless contact-range bullets that left zero room for survival. As for Kenji Sato, his lifeless body was discovered hanging halfway out of an open steel shipping container parked on the edge of the flooded pier. He had been wrapped tightly from head to toe in heavy, rusted maritime anchor chains, and the container itself had been half filled with stagnant rainwater blown in by the typhoon, drowning him in his own syndicate's terminal. Remarkably, the heavy velvet pouch containing millions of dollars in raw, uncut diamonds sat completely untouched and uncounted right on the mahogany desk inside the office. The intruder had completely ignored the immense monetary wealth, stripping the facility only of the physical extortion ledgers and the encrypted data drives exposing the political corruption network. The assassin had slipped away into the churning waters of the harbor utilizing a high-speed personal watercraft, navigating the complex, narrow concrete drainage canals out toward the open sea while the storm raged above. Japanese federal investigators scoured the docks for fingerprints, fibers, and digital signatures, but found nothing, ultimately sealing the entire investigation under the classified internal file name, Container 12 Liquidation. Months after the harbor incident, the case file remained a phantom haunting the elite divisions of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, dismissed by superiors as an impossible execution by a ghost that left no footprints on the wet concrete piers. Yet deep within the secure digital archives of the security agency, strange anomalies began to multiply across unrelated criminal databases. Detectives assigned to review cold cases noticed an identical signature surfacing in major financial hubs across 3 continents, massive syndicates dismantled in single nights, ledgers burned to fine gray ash, and high-ranking bosses found drowned or crushed in isolated rooms while priceless fortunes in cash and diamonds were left completely untouched. There were no surveillance tapes showing the assassin's entry, no identifiable DNA samples left behind on the victims, and no witnesses willing to speak. The only universal constant linking these geographically isolated massacres was an old, chilling audio recording captured on a damaged security monitor moments before a facility's power grid failed, 3 slow, deliberate raps echoing against steel, followed by a heavy, suffocating silence that left every investigator staring into the dark, wondering whose name was currently being written into the next page of the eternal ledger. January 2014, the lawless, law-forsaken outskirts of Araguaina in northern Brazil, swallowed completely by the height of the torrential wet season. A relentless, violent tropical downpour battered the sprawling agricultural soy plantations, the muddy access tracks, and the dense, encroaching walls of the Amazonian timber tracts with deafening, unbroken fury. The massive, sprawling Oliveira estate sat isolated in the middle of this vast wilderness, a heavily fortified, multi-acre agricultural compound that served as the primary regional command center, financial clearinghouse, and operational headquarters for a ruthless land grab syndicate, illegal logging cartel, and human displacement ring operated with an iron fist by a corrupt local baron named Carlos Oliveira. The estate was built like a modern fortress, surrounded by 12-foot-high electrified security fencing, reinforced concrete perimeter walls, and heavy steel gates monitored around the clock by rotating shifts of heavily armed private security mercenaries. Inside the brightly lit, sprawling two-story administrative ranch house, Carlos Oliveira and his closest operational lieutenants were gathered around a massive hardwood conference table, reviewing fraudulent land titles, bribed government registry documents, and heavy ledgers detailing the violent expulsion of indigenous farming communities from protected forest reserves. At precisely 1:45 a.m., cutting through the heavy rumble of distant thunder and the pounding rain, two unbadged, midnight black four-wheel-drive utility trucks tore down the muddy access road and rammed straight through the ranch's reinforced iron perimeter gates without slowing down, shattering the locking mechanisms into twisted scrap metal. The trucks fishtailed wildly in the churning red clay before screeching to a halt right in front of the main administrative compound, their high-intensity LED light bars cutting blinding white swathes through the sheets of driving rain. Before the estate's private guards stationed inside the courtyard guardhouse could even lift their automatic weapons from their laps or sound the master alarm, heavy-set, professional operatives clad in dark tactical gear and waterproof hoods leaped from the tailgates into the deep mud. Within a fraction of a second, high-rate-of-fire automatic rifles opened up with a deafening, disciplined roar, unleashing a devastating crossfire directly into the compound. The 5 armed perimeter guards caught out in the open courtyard were cut down instantly, their bodies violently thrown backward into the churning red sludge, lifeless before they even hit the ground. The tactical assault was executed with absolute ruthless efficiency, leaving zero room for defense, negotiation, or escape as the raiders systematically advanced toward the main doors of the ranch house. Inside the executive boardroom, the deafening rattle of gunfire and the shattering glass of the lower security windows instantly shattered the complacent atmosphere, sending Carlos Oliveira and his lieutenants scrambling to their feet in sheer panic. Oliveira drew a heavy, gold-plated .44 Magnum from his holster, shouting frantic orders for his men to secure the internal panic room while rushing toward the heavy mahogany doors. But before anyone could reach the reinforced threshold, a colossal, explosive breech charge detonated against the exterior frame with a concussive roar that blew the solid wood doors off their iron hinges, sending jagged splinters flying across the conference table like shrapnel. Through the thick, swirling plumes of gray smoke and flying dust stepped an imposing, towering figure wrapped in a heavy, glistening rubberized canvas coat that dripped dark, stagnant rainwater onto the scorched floorboards. The remaining lieutenants emptied their sidearms in blind terror, but the bullets glanced harmlessly off the intruder's advancing form as the heavy steel blade of a felling axe flashed through the gloom. Within 30 breathless seconds, the room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of rainwater from the shattered windows and 3 slow, deliberate raps echoing against the back wall, signaling that the ledger had just been claimed once more. The invading tactical strike force moved through the opulent corridors of the main ranch house with terrifying, synchronized precision, their heavy combat boots making a wet, rhythmic splashing sound across the polished tile floors. They systematically ignored the cowering domestic staff and terrified kitchen workers, bypassing them entirely as they breached the rear executive wing where Carlos Oliveira had barricaded himself inside his private walk-in vault room. Carlos was clutching a satellite phone with trembling hands, screaming frantically into the receiver for regional security forces and cartel enforcers who would never arrive, completely trapped within his own reinforced stronghold. The operatives wasted zero time positioning a compact, shaped thermal charge directly against the center of the vault's thick, reinforced steel door. With a blinding, instantaneous flash of white-hot magnesium fire and a thunderous concussive boom that rattled the window panes throughout the entire estate, the heavy locking mechanism was blown completely outward into the hallway in a shower of glowing metal shrapnel and thick gray smoke. Before the corrupt Baron could even register what was happening, heavy-gloved hands hauled him roughly out of the vault by his collar, tossing him onto the floor like a sack of dead weight while the raiders methodically went to work. They bypassed the expensive jewelry, gold bullion, and stacked bricks of paper currency sitting neatly on the upper shelves, showing absolute indifference to the millions of dollars in liquid wealth. Instead, they scooped up every single fraudulent land title, forged government deed, registry document, and illegal forestry license, stuffing them methodically into heavy, waterproof canvas cargo sacks until the shelves were completely stripped bare. With the physical evidence secured, industrial-grade chemical accelerant was poured liberally and systematically across the remaining expensive furniture, custom mahogany desks, leather armchairs, Persian carpets, and dark wood wall paneling throughout the sprawling administrative suite. Carlos Oliveira was shot twice in the abdomen with suppressed rounds, collapsing heavily onto the floor as the volatile liquid ignited with a sudden, roaring whoosh, spreading a wall of intense orange flames across the room. The operative stepped right over his bleeding form, slipping back out into the night through the shattered double doors. While the torrential tropical rain lashing the tin roof above prevented the fire from leaping outward to ignite neighboring residential structures, the entire interior office suite was completely gutted down to bare, blackened concrete studs and melted structural steel within a matter of minutes, reducing years of criminal operations to swirling clouds of toxic soot. When federal police patrols finally arrived at dawn, drawn by the lingering plume of dark, oily smoke rising against the gray morning sky, they found all the syndicate's documentation reduced entirely to gray ash and the entire security detail executed with surgical, unsparing precision. The attackers had vanished completely into the impassable, muddy mountain tracks long before state reinforcements could mobilize, leaving regional authorities and federal prosecutors with zero forensic leads, zero physical evidence, and a completely wiped slate, forcing them to officially categorize the catastrophic carnage as an internal, untraceable cartel turf war. Yet, despite the case being officially closed and archived in the dark basements of the federal courthouse, the terror lingered long after the smoke cleared from the ruins of the Oliveira estate. Local farmers working the distant soy field still whispered in hushed tones about the phantom figures moving through the wet jungle timber at midnight, leaving behind no footprints in the deep red mud. Whenever the heavy wet season storms battered the region and knocked out the local power grid, the surviving plantation workers swore they could hear three slow, hollow raps echoing against the charred concrete walls of the abandoned executive suite, a chilling reminder that the ancient ledger remained active, and no amount of wealth or reinforced steel could ever shield a corrupt soul from the cold, inevitable arrival of the final reckoning. December 2008, the bleak, freezing, and industrial outskirts of Saratov, Russia, trapped deep within the biting misery of a severe sub-zero winter. A wretched, miserable mixture of melting gray snow, freezing black rain, and howling Arctic winds coated the barren, desolate landscape in a thick, treacherous layer of black ice and dangerous slush. Deep within a forgotten industrial zone sat an abandoned, sprawling Soviet-era cattle slaughterhouse, a massive, decaying concrete monolith featuring shattered windows, rusted iron gantries, and cavernous chambers that had been left to rot by the state decades prior. In recent months, however, this bleak architectural relic had been secretly repurposed as a heavily fortified clandestine safe house, weapons depot, and currency laundering clearinghouse for a major international automotive and arms smuggling ring commanded by a ruthless syndicate boss named Dmitry Ivanov. Stationed inside the cavernous, unheated central processing hall of the slaughterhouse, Dmitri and 3 of his most trusted, heavily armed lieutenants sat huddled around a massive, stainless steel veterinary sorting table. They were deep into a tense, midnight cash-counting operation, manually sorting and banding massive stacks of illicit $100 bills under the harsh, flickering glare of a single bare incandescent bulb dangling loosely from a frayed cord overhead. The interior of the building smelled intensely of stagnant dampness, rust, and old animal blood trapped deep within the porous concrete floors. Above their heads, the decaying, flat concrete roof was severely compromised, allowing freezing rainwater to leak through the structural cracks in a steady, maddening, rhythmic cadence, drip, 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 splashing loudly against the metal table and pooling in the dark corners of the hall. At precisely 2:30 a.m., cutting straight through the howling roar of the winter storm outside, a heavy, long-abandoned industrial iron sliding door at the far end of the long concrete access corridor slowly groaned open on its rusted tracks. A tall, imposing figure stepped across the threshold without making a single sound, clad from head to toe in a heavy, insulated military-grade parka and a rigid, industrial heavy-duty respirator mask that completely obscured their facial features. Before Dmitry Ivanov or any of his 3 lieutenants could even register the intrusion, drop their money stacks, or draw the loaded firearms resting on the table, the intruder raised a suppressed submachine gun with terrifying mechanical speed and swept the room in a fluid, calculated motion. Within the span of 3 breathless seconds, a series of muffled, spitting pops echoed off the high concrete ceiling, and all 3 bodyguards collapsed instantly onto the blood-spattered floor, lifeless before their bodies even finished hitting the concrete. Dmitri froze in terror, his hands hovering over the metal table as hot blood from his fallen lieutenant began dripping onto his boots. The masked figure advanced with slow, deliberate strides across the frozen concrete, ignoring the millions in untraced cash scattered across the room. Without a word, a gloved hand grabbed Dmitri by the collar, dragging him toward the back of the chamber while 3 heavy raps echoed against the iron rafters. After stripping the syndicate's financial ledgers and burning them to ash in an old furnace, the intruder vanished into the freezing Russian night, leaving Dmitri tied to a metal hook in the dark, awaiting a dawn that would bring no rescue. Hours later, as the pale, sickly light of morning tried in vain to pierce the thick, frost-covered windows of the abandoned slaughterhouse, local stray dogs began gathering near the rusted iron loading bays, whimpering and backing away from the open doorway as a strange, unnatural cold settled over the entire industrial yard. Inside the cavernous processing hall, the millions in unsorted currency remained untouched, frozen stiff against the stainless steel table, while the heavy iron hooks overhead swayed gently in the draft. Investigators who finally breached the compound days later found no tracks in the deep snow surrounding the perimeter, no physical evidence left behind on the frozen concrete, and no trace of Dmitry Ivanov other than an old ledger entry carved deep into the frost on the back wall, marking another name permanently crossed off the eternal list. Dmitry Ivanov took a high-velocity, suppressed round straight through his right knee, the bone shattering instantly beneath the kinetic force as he collapsed heavily onto the wet, blood-stained concrete floor with a sharp, choked gasp of agony. He whimpered in absolute, unadulterated terror, clutching his bleeding leg as he frantically dragged himself backward across the freezing, slippery surface, leaving a dark, smeared trail of crimson in the melting slush and rainwater pooling around his boots. The intruder stepped forward out of the shadows with deliberate, unhurried, and bone-chillingly calm boot steps, the heavy soles crunching loudly against scattered cartridge casings and frozen debris. The masked figure stopped directly over Dmitri, towering above him like an executioner carved from solid stone, looking down through the tinted lenses of the industrial respirator mask without a single flicker of emotion. Dmitri opened his mouth, desperately trying to bargain, offering millions in hidden bank accounts, smuggled vehicles, and untraceable bearer bonds, but no words came past his trembling lips. The intruder made zero move toward the massive piles of paper currency stacked high on the stainless steel table, completely ignoring the literal millions of dollars in cash that littered the room. Instead, the killer reached down with a gloved hand, grabbed a heavy, reinforced black canvas diplomatic pouch containing all of the syndicate's encrypted satellite phones, master cryptographic keys, and offshore communication ledgers, and slung the heavy strap securely over their shoulder. A single, final, perfectly placed suppressed shot echoed hollowly off the high, damp concrete ceiling, bringing an absolute and permanent end to the syndicate's reign in the region. The assassin turned on their heel without wasting another second, walking back down the long, echoing corridor and disappearing out into the freezing, storm-battered night. 12 long hours ticked by before a patrol of Russian military police intelligence officers, tipped off by an anonymous encrypted satellite signal, forced their way into the abandoned slaughterhouse through the rusted iron doors. They stepped into a scene of absolute, clinical devastation. The three lieutenants were cold on the floor, Dmitry Ivanov lay lifeless near the sorting table, and the immense piles of paper cash sat entirely untouched and forgotten right beside the dead men. The forensic teams and military investigators scoured every square inch of the sprawling, decaying concrete facility, but they found no fingerprints, no hair follicles, no footwear impressions, and zero digital traces left behind on the network frequencies. The elite killer had utilized a high-powered, military-spec snowmobile parked deep within the dense pine tree line half a mile away, roaring off into the endless, unmapped expanses of the freezing Siberian forests and vanishing as completely as a ghost caught in a morning thaw. Even now, years after the slaughterhouse files were officially sealed and buried deep within the military archives of Moscow, local hunters and backcountry trappers refused to cross the frozen ridge line near the old facility after sunset. They speak in hushed whispers around their winter campfires about the faint, mechanical hum of a heavy engine echoing across the whiteout wastes, accompanied by the chilling sound of 3 slow, deliberate raps tapping against frozen pine trunks. Those who have ventured too close to the perimeter report finding strange, circular depressions melted deep into the hard-packed snow where no human foot has ever walked, surrounding a single patch of scorched earth where an invisible ledger continues to record the names of those who think they can hide behind wealth and iron doors. Deep inside the command bunkers of international intelligence agencies, analysts who accidentally stumble upon the orphaned case files whisper of an unbroken chain stretching back over a century, a phantom entity unbound by borders, nationality, or law, executing the corrupt with ruthless, mechanical perfection. No government has ever identified the organization, no bank account has ever traced the assets, and no survivor has ever looked behind the mask and lived to speak of it. The wind howls louder through the frozen trees, carrying the faint, metallic scent of ozone and copper across the snow-choked wilderness, a solemn reminder that no empire lasts forever and every hidden crime eventually finds its final page. May 2017, the sprawling, chaotic, and dangerous urban metropolis of Johannesburg, South Africa, caught in the grip of a ferocious, highly violent electrical storm and torrential downpour. Sheets of heavy, blinding rain lashed relentlessly across the sprawling downtown avenues, instantly transforming the steep asphalt streets into rushing, muddy rivers while violent bolts of lightning tore across the midnight sky, casting strobing, electric blue flashes across the decaying city skyline. Deep within the industrial fringes of the city stood a sprawling, historic hotel that had been partially abandoned and condemned by municipal authorities years prior, its once grand Art Deco facade now peeling, graffiti-covered, and surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted security fencing. Despite its dilapidated exterior and the lack of running water or stable municipal power, Suite 404 on the 4th floor of the East Wing had been secretly rented out under false, short-term corporate aliases by an international raw diamond smuggling syndicate led by a ruthless, paranoid crime lord named Brian de Clock. Inside the heavily barricaded, dimly lit suite, Brian and two of his most trusted international buyers sat around a mahogany table littered with jeweler's loupes, electronic scales, and industrial velvet sorting trays. They were in the final stages of inspecting a massive, multi-million-dollar shipment of smuggled, uncut alluvial diamonds freshly flown in from the remote mining fields of the northern interior, entirely absorbed in the glittering, raw stones under the harsh beam of a battery-powered work lamp. The air inside the hotel room was thick with tension, smelling of stale cigarette smoke, damp plaster, and nervous sweat, while the constant, deafening roar of thunder outside rattled the single-pane windows in their rotting wooden frames. Stationed outside in the pitch-black, unlit hallway was a solitary, heavily armed security mercenary hired to guard the stairwell access and watch for any unexpected interruptions. At precisely 4:10 a.m., cutting straight through the heavy percussion of the thunder rolling overhead, a tall, silent figure stepped out from the open stairwell landing and moved down the dark hotel hallway with absolute, predator-like stealth. The solitary guard never even had a chance to lift his service weapon or turn his head, before he could register the presence of an intruder. A heavy, weighted iron pipe struck him with bone-shattering force across the temple, dropping him instantly to the threadbare carpet without emitting a single gasp. The elite strike team moved instantly, smoothly breaching the heavy deadbolt wooden door of Suite 404 with a swift, synchronized kick that splintered the frame wide open. Before Brian the Clock or his two buyers could look up from the table or dive for the loaded firearms resting beside their briefcases, the intruders unleashed a blinding, lethal volley of suppressed gunfire directly into the center of the room. The execution was blindingly fast, ruthlessly calculated, and devastatingly violent. Exactly 8 micro-caliber rounds were fired in rapid succession, and all 3 syndicate operatives collapsed instantly onto the plush-carpeted floor, lifeless before their bodies even hit the ground, leaving the room silent once again save for the drumming of the rain outside. Brian the Clock, though critically wounded with a bullet passing cleanly through his shoulder, miraculously retained consciousness as the heavy, rubber-clad boots of the assassin stepped over the bleeding corpses of his buyers. The intruder bypassed millions of dollars in unpolished diamonds glittering under the dying work lamp, showing absolute indifference to the physical wealth scattered across the mahogany table. Instead, a gloved hand reached out, gathered every encrypted ledger, buyer list, and digital drive into a heavy canvas bag, and then hoisted Brian by his collar. Dragging the whimpering crime boss toward the center of the room while 3 slow, metallic raps echoed against the rotting structural beams overhead, the operative carved an old, familiar mark into the peeling plaster wall with a hunting knife. Minutes later, the suite was swallowed by a roaring, chemically accelerated fire that melted the diamonds into useless slag, leaving local authorities with nothing more than charred ruins and a haunting reminder that the ledger always demands payment in full before the storm clears. The invading operatives wasted zero time standing over the lifeless bodies sprawled across the carpet of Suite 404. Moving with the synchronized discipline of a Black Ops extraction unit, one of the operatives immediately knelt down beside the heavy, wall-mounted portable hotel safe tucked into the corner of the room, pulling a compact, industrial-grade thermal cutting torch from a tactical utility pouch. With a hiss of compressed oxygen, a blinding, needle-thin jet of white-hot magnesium flame ignited in the darkness, roaring silently as it burned straight through the heavy steel locking bolts and reinforced hinges of the safe door in less than 40 seconds. The heavy steel door swung open with a dull, echoing thud. Inside sat heavy, vacuum-sealed velvet bags containing millions of dollars in uncut alluvial diamonds, alongside thick stacks of untraceable international bearer bonds. The operatives scooped up every single pouch of diamonds, paying no attention to the scattered cash or expensive watches left behind. At the same time, the second operative systematically moved across the room with a heavy steel framing hammer, smashing every single mobile phone, encrypted laptop, satellite communicator, and tape recording device into unrecognizable fragments of plastic and circuit boards to ensure zero digital breadcrumbs remained. Before heading for the exit, one of the operatives noticed Brian DeClock's personal, monogrammed silver cigarette case resting on the mahogany coffee table beside an ash-strewn tray. Reaching into a pocket, the assassin pulled out a specialized waterproof permanent ink marker and deliberately scraped a final, chilling message across the polished metal surface: "The debt of the mines is reclaimed." The assassins moved with absolute silence, sliding open the balcony door and descending the building's exterior. Rusted iron fire escaped down through the driving sheets of torrential rain and howling wind. They climbed directly into an unplated, late-model sedan idling without lights in the flooded, trash-strewn alleyway below, and seamlessly melted away into the labyrinth of dark, rushing, waterlogged streets of downtown Johannesburg before the echoes of the storm could even register the escape. When local forensic teams and federal detectives finally breached the hotel suite hours later, drawn by anonymous electronic tips routed through encrypted offshore servers, they found a pristine scene of calculated violence. They failed to recover a single usable fingerprint, a single hair strand, or a single shred of forensic evidence from the entire floor. The case was instantly classified, sealing the raid into the municipal archives as one of the fastest, cleanest, and most violent closed-room heists in the entire history of the continent's criminal underworld, a ghost operation that left behind nothing except a silver cigarette case and an empty vault. Even years after the Johannesburg Police Department quietly shuttered the investigation and moved the thick dossier into the deep storage basement vaults, the legend of the Phantom Strike team continued to cast a long, suffocating shadow over the international trafficking network spanning the African continent. Syndicate bosses who once operated with absolute impunity behind layers of private mercenaries, bribed customs officials, and fortified compounds suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders at every shadow, terrified that the next midnight thunderstorm would bring the relentless, heavy tread of combat boots down their corridors. In the darkest hours of the night, when the wind howled through abandoned urban high-rises and the rain lashed relentlessly against cracked window panes, low-level informants and corrupt brokers still whispered about the unyielding, nameless entity that tracked illegal wealth not for greed or personal profit, but as part of an ancient, cosmic balancing act. They spoke of secure vaults blown open from the inside out, of multi-million-dollar shipments of diamonds vanishing into thin air while paper ledgers burned down to gray ash, and of the unmistakable, chilling rhythm of 3 slow, deliberate raps echoing against iron doors just moments before the lights went out for good. No government decree, no private army, and no offshore fortune could ever purchase immunity from the ledger, for the men who built their empires on the suffering of the innocent always learned, too late, that the final entry was already written in blood and rain, waiting only for the storm to break.